Hello everyone. I'm back today with another review on a history book. This one's called Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine by Anne Applebaum. Applebaum is a historian studying Central and Eastern Europe, particularly as they relate to the former Soviet Union, and she's lived both in the US and in Poland, and both for a considerable length of time. Her book specifically covers a period in Ukrainian history often referred to as the Holodomor, literally meaning killing by starvation, or sometimes also called the Great Famine or Terror Famine. Check out the Wikipedia page for a rough outline if you're interested. It's pretty informative. Now, it's a tough book, and although I learned a lot from it and found it to be a well-presented scholarly work, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for everyone. I'll talk more about my specific impressions, but the short explanation is that this book goes into quite a lot of detail on the subjects it describes, and someone seeking to learn more about these general topics needn't delve into this over 400-page book to generally understand what went on. That is to say, if you're not a historian trying to track down every possible account of the famine, this book, though well written, might just be too much information for you. Basically, the Holodomor was a horrible famine caused, or at least exacerbated by Soviet policies that killed an estimated 3 to 4 million people living in Ukraine in the years of 1932 to 1933. This book discusses the policies that led to and worsened this famine, which astonishingly occurred in a region of the Soviet Union that was actually traditionally a major producer of grain. Many of the consequences of the famine still resonate today in the Ukrainian mindset, contributing to tensions between Ukraine and Russia regarding Ukraine's sovereignty. A lot of scholars consider the Holodomor to have been an intentional genocide of the Ukrainian people, knowingly inflicted by Stalin and the upper-level Soviets to squelch dissenters and those who would have seen Ukraine become an independent nation from the Soviet Union. The alternative interpretation is that the disproportionate effect of the famine on the Ukrainian people was unfortunate, but not directly intentional, with some going as far as to deny that it was a man-made famine at all, intentional or not, instead claiming that it was simply a natural phenomenon. Others, including the Soviet leadership themselves, have claimed that the famine was man-made, but that it was caused by the stubborn resistance of Ukrainian nationalists and farmers to collectivization, rather than by the Soviet policies of collectivization themselves and the grain requisitioning that accompanied them. Although I don't know a ton about this debate myself, it apparently is still a hotly debated topic. And Anne Applebaum, as you expect from the subtitle of the book, argues in this book for the viewpoint that it was knowingly and intentionally executed, and although I'm sure opposing viewpoints are worth reading as well, for the remainder of this review I'll be presenting the history primarily as Applebaum tells it. Now, this book is not exactly an easy read. In addition to going pretty deeply into specific historical events, it contains graphic depictions of violence inflicted by both the Soviet regime and by desperate, starving Ukrainians on one another, including terror, cannibalism, and other savagery. To be fair, there are some striking tales of heroism and resilience as well, but this is not a happy book with a happy take-home message, and it shouldn't be. Beyond the disturbing content itself, this book can be a challenging read for its inherently complex coverage of politics, social movements, and everyday life and death, and because it often goes into extensive detail about each of these aspects. The first third or so of the book deals with a history that occurred from the rise of the Soviet Union and Stalin in the late 1910s and early 1920s, through the Holodomor itself in the early 1930s. For one thing, it describes Ukrainian nationalism and the Ukrainian independence movement, which the Soviet leadership in Russia naturally saw as a great threat to their rising empire. The Soviets found themselves in a difficult place in the late 1920s where they had to simultaneously appease the Ukrainians and let them do their thing to avoid things getting too out of control, all while secretly knowing this was temporary and planning to go back on it later. This topic is treated especially well in the book. Now, the early part of this book also focuses on how the prior famine of the early 1920s differed from the Holodomor, and exactly how and why Stalin and other upper-level party officials dealt differently with the famine of the 1920s than that of the 1930s. Specifically, Applebaum argues that in the 1920s, Stalin had to appease opponents on both sides of the political spectrum, with Leon Trotsky on the left and Nikolai Bukharin on the right, both of whom he had eliminated as threats by the 1930s. Therefore, it was in Stalin's interests in the 1920s to strike a balance between aiming for all-out implementation of communism and taking more gradual steps to get there, including some permission of market trading and some appeasement of Ukrainian nationalists, which were part of the so-called New Economic Plan of the 1920s. By the 1930s, though, this appeasement policy would be sharply reversed as the Soviet leadership pushed to achieve the goals of Stalin's new five-year plan for economic growth. Despite the animosity of the Russian Soviets against Ukrainian peasants, who they saw pretty unilaterally as nationalists and capitalists, and therefore as political opponents, they absolutely needed control of Ukrainian territory to achieve their economic goals, since Ukraine, with its fertile soil and high proportion of arable land, was part of the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. In line with the Soviets' goals of squeezing every last bit of resources out of the Ukrainian countryside, they again branded any Ukrainian nationalists as counter-revolutionary, enabling the use of violence and terror to destroy them and to suppress any further dissent within Ukraine. With all that said, as you can imagine, this first part of the book goes into a lot of political and policy-oriented detail, which can be a lot to process if, like me, you're fairly new to this topic. The second third of the book talks about the execution of the policies directly leading to the famine of the early 1930s, at least in Applebaum's assessment, and ends with a thorough description of the harrowing results. The regime intentionally turned peasants against one another in a process called dekulakization, with poorer peasants being encouraged to topple the kulaks, or wealthier peasants, in their villagers who were seen as the embodiment of capitalism and anti-Soviet ideals. Naturally, this led to a situation in which few peasants were motivated to work hard and to succeed at producing lots of grain, which would lead them to become precisely the kulaks that everyone was fighting against. This problem was not ameliorated either by the forced collectivization of all farms into single collective units, despite the leadership's promises that this would bring about greater efficiency, although it did further exacerbate tensions among the peasants as the increasingly hungry peasants began turning against those who somehow still managed to have food. Exacerbating these problems was the secret police of the OGPU, an early precursor to the KGB that started as a means of the state for requisitioning grain from hungry peasants who were hesitant to give it up, and grew eventually into a full-blown state police and even a mass terror organization tasked with eliminating all dissent from Ukraine, whether real or imagined. Despite Ukraine being less productive than ever before, the Soviet leadership still expected greater grain contributions and efficiency than ever before to satisfy Stalin's five-year plan, and any peasants not meeting their unreasonable quotas were assumed to be hiding grain. Naturally, some of them were in these dire conditions, even though they knew that to be caught doing so would incur a penalty of imprisonment or even just immediate death. This was because although the Soviet leadership promised the grain would be distributed back to them according to their needs, they assumed that this wasn't really the truth. Others were simply suspected to be hiding grain, even though in reality they simply had nothing left to give up. And amidst all of this, while Ukrainian peasants were starving, the Soviets were exporting considerable quantities of grain abroad to procure hard currency that they could use for industrialization and upgrading machinery. Whether Stalin and the Soviet leadership were intentionally starving the Ukrainian peasants here, or instead simply had a totally ignorant perception of what was actually happening in Ukraine, was not fully clear to me in this part of the book, but it seemed impossible to me that their anti-Ukrainian prejudices didn't at least play some role, a significant role, in these draconian grain requisitioning policies. Furthermore, their ideological tendency to view factory workers in the cities as the real proletariat of the communist state, and peasants as more of a backward class that would gradually fall out of existence, surely made them less sympathetic to the plight of the Ukrainian peasants. And this in itself was not even the whole picture, as peasants living in Russian territory were described as living in conditions that, even if not ideal, were far superior to those of their starving neighbors in Ukraine. So to me, these observations do support the notion that the starvation of Ukrainian peasants during the so-called Holodomor was a deliberate policy. And given the political relations between Russia and Ukraine at the time, in addition to our knowledge that Stalin was not averse to using any means necessary to achieve what he saw as desired outcomes, it seems reasonable to infer that he conducted these policies not only deliberately, but with political motivation. This more political nature of the policies is maybe not quite as clearly proven in this book, although it seems to me at least very plausible. The final third of the book deals with the aftermath of the Holodomor, how it affected Ukraine and its relations with the broader Soviet Union, and how it's remembered and affects people's attitudes to this very day. Applebaum talks about how in mid-1933, Stalin and the Soviet leadership began to reverse many of their harsh grain procurement policies, though it still took a while for the Ukrainian region to really recover. It wasn't totally clear to me from this book just what was the logic or new information or new politics that led to changing the policy at this point. What was clearly described, though, was the Soviet leadership's broad efforts to first blame the famine on the counter-revolutionaries and the kulak farmers themselves, and then later to cover up the famine both internally and externally, including eventual outright denial that it existed whatsoever, and punishment of anyone who mentioned it in public discourse. For example, when the 1937 Soviet Union census, which was presumably rigorous and well conducted, turned up 10 million fewer citizens than expected, many of the leading academics and statisticians involved in conducting and reporting on it were executed by firing squads. The census was scrapped, and one performed with so-called more accurate methods was released in 1939 to demonstrate the success and growth under the 5-year plan. This policy of intentional disinformation, which continued for many years and arguably still affects the information we have about the famine to this very day, made it extremely hard for people to tell what was actually going on. So much of the information we have about the famine still comes from the first-hand accounts of Ukrainian refugees and other expatriates, whose stories were often brushed off by the Soviets as not credible. Adding to the complication was the fact that with the rising menace of the Nazi Party and its early invasion of Eastern Europe, those who opposed the Soviet regime and their actions in Ukraine were often painted as Nazi sympathizers. In fact, most Ukrainians at first welcomed the Nazi invaders into their homeland. I mean, who can blame them after what they'd been through under the Soviets? But the Nazis would likewise come to treat them simply as a pawn in their game of global domination, eventually leading to further famine, although that topic is mostly outside the scope of this book. The result, though, was that many European powers and the US, even though they had some idea of the atrocities in Ukraine, were hesitant to acknowledge it and certainly never spoke out about it, knowing they would need the support of the Soviets to control the rising power of Nazi Germany, as they did in World War II. Similarly, outside journalists working in the Soviet Union and stationed in Moscow had to choose between writing accurate reports of what they knew to be happening in Ukraine and being kicked out of the country or even risking death, or reporting on the official but false Soviet narrative of events, which afforded them luxury treatment and meant they had the freedom to at least report on other events in Moscow. The unfortunate consequence of all these factors is that even to this day, Ukrainian nationalists are still often just dismissed by pro-Russian groups as Nazis or fascists, even though this is clearly a gross mischaracterization and a sort of political rhetoric. Applebaum also explores the world's gradual reckoning, in some cases, of what happened in Ukraine, including the question of whether these events can be called a genocide. As I mentioned, this is a topic of open debate among Western academics, as far as I can tell, and it certainly is still politically touchy, so this affects nations' official stances on what happened and how to classify it. In the years that followed the famine, Stalin's leadership began a process of Russification, encouraging ethnic Russians to migrate to Ukraine and basically fill the gaps on the farms created by dying peasants. And this had the bonus effect for the Soviet leadership's point of view of diluting the ethnic Ukrainianness of Ukraine. This, along with the rhetoric before and during the famine, lends credence to the idea that Stalin and the Soviet leadership conducted these harsh and ultimately deadly grain requisitioning policies intentionally and with political motivation to suppress and even murder their political opposition. The arguments over whether the term genocide can be applied, Applebaum argues, have in many ways become more political than intellectual, partly because the Soviet Union promoted an international definition of the term genocide that specifically excluded their actions in Ukraine preceding the Ukrainian famine. Similarly, even if we were to accept the Soviet leadership's actions as an intentional effort to kill the Ukrainian peasants, it remains a bit unclear still whether this falls within the term genocide, because it's unclear to what extent these policies would have been motivated specifically by ethnic resentments and hatred, as opposed to a more general class-focused attempt to eliminate the peasantry and or a politically oriented attempt to eliminate political opponents. I guess my 2 cents is that, although I'm not very familiar with the academic debate here, it seems like if a policy would lead to extermination of an ethnic group, it should probably be considered a genocide, whether or not that was the primary motivation, so to speak, because class politics and ethnic identities are frankly impossible to disentangle. I'm not going to get any further into this debate, though, other than to say I understand there are decent arguments in support of both sides, but also that in some ways this seems to me a question of definitions and terminology, less interesting and important than the more specific question, were Stalin's and the Soviets' actions an intentional, murderous effort against the Ukrainian peasants? To this question, it will be unsurprising based on the title of this book that Applebaum's answer is yes. The famine was man-made and was an intentional method of political repression with predictable and intended consequences. And I pretty much already covered the main topics of what this book has to say about that, although I'm sure there's plenty more to explore in this area. So I think I'll leave it at that for my summary of the book. Wrapping things up, this is a really solid scholarly work on the Holodomor, or the Ukrainian famine of 1932 to 1933, and how it relates to the political situation before, during, and after the about 2 years of the famine itself. Although it covers just a brief period in Ukrainian history, it gave me at least a better context for understanding Ukraine's ongoing struggles to this day for effective independence from Russian hegemony. The work is highly informative with extensive citations of primary sources, but it probably goes into a higher level of detail than the general reader, and by that I mean most non-historians, would generally want. If you're interested in learning about this famine on a higher level, which I highly recommend, you don't really need to read this medium to long academic work to do so. I've linked a few pretty short videos below that cover many of the key points in a more digestible format. Have you read this or any other good books about Ukrainian history? Do you have a recommendation for another history book I should check out? Leave me a comment and let me know. Bye, and happy reading.